Hello again. We sometimes deceive ourselves into thinking that we in Britain live in a more violent country than was the case during the reign of Queen Victoria, but it's not so. Take, for example, the murder of police officers, which is today almost unheard of. When PC Keith Blakelock was murdered on Broadwater Farm in 1985 by a rioting mob, this was often cited as an example of the sort of event which is uniquely horrible and had been quite unprecedented up to that time. This particular violent death is sometimes thought of as marking a watershed in relations between the police and certain sections of society. Really, this is quite absurd. The murder of police officers in this way having begun almost as soon as the police forces in the modern sense were established in this country. The deaths of police officers during disturbances on the streets of 19th century Britain were a regular occurrence. In stark contrast to the banner headlines and widespread coverage which greeted the murder of PC Blakelock in 1985, similar deaths in the late 1830s and 1840s rated only a few column inches in the Times. On the night of Sunday, the 29th of September, 1839, 2 years after Victoria became Queen, a police officer in London was killed by a 500-strong mob. On October the 1st, the Times reported the incident under the brief headline, Murder of a Policeman at Deptford. Only 4 column inches were devoted to the death of a police officer in this way, a total of 350 words or so. It simply wasn't newsworthy. Among items which demanded greater coverage in that day's edition were the municipal reform of the Corporation of London and the shipwreck off the Maldives. The death of a police officer at the hands of a crowd was not so unusual as to merit more extensive reporting. A few years earlier, on May the 13th, 1833, a policeman in the newly formed Metropolitan Police was killed under circumstances very similar, indeed almost identical, to those which resulted in the death of Keith Blakelock. An organisation called the National Union of the Working Classes arranged to hold a meeting at Coldbath Fields in the London district of Clerkenwell, with a view to campaigning for the extension of the vote to working class men. To the government, this smacked of sedition, and Home Secretary Lord Melbourne issued a proclamation forbidding any such assembly to be held. The public notice from the Home Office reads as follows. Posters have been put up and distributed in various parts of London advertising that a meeting will be held in Coldbath Fields on Monday 13th of May as a means of campaigning for the rights of the people. A public meeting held for such a purpose is dangerous to the public peace and illegal. All classes of His Majesty's subjects are hereby warned not to attend such a meeting nor to take any part in it. Notice is hereby given that the police have strict orders to maintain and secure the public peace and to arrest anybody offending against this order, so that they may be dealt with according to the law. When the meeting took place, the police broke it up and kettled, as we now say, some of the crowd in Calthorpe Street. Calthorpe Street has changed little since that day in 1833. Tall, dark terraces of late Georgian townhouses with wrought iron balconies still line the narrow street. There are a number of eyewitness accounts from the people living in those houses who watched the tragedy unfold from their balconies. Some of the streets in the area are still cobbled rather than covered with tarmac, and it's very easy when walking around the district to visualise precisely how the tragedy unfolded. The men being pushed up Calthorpe Street from one end and hemmed in from the other were in no mood to be confined in that way. They began to grow restless and attempted to fight their way free of the police cordon. It was at this point that the police officers drew their batons. The street became a seething mass of angry men, punching, kicking, and lashing out at each other with anything which came to hand. A hail of stones and half bricks rained down on the police lines. Sergeant John Brooks, who had spent 25 years in the army before joining the police, decided to remove some of the poles that were being waved about by the protesters. He grabbed at an American flag, which was being carried by a man called George Fursey, who at once pulled out a dagger and stabbed Sergeant Brooks in the chest. By great good fortune, the blade struck a rib, otherwise it would, according to the surgeon who later treated him, have slid straight into the officer's heart. Brooks fell back with a cry, upon which PC Henry Redwood tried to snatch the flag. Fursey stabbed him as well, through the forearm. Redwood responded by beating Fursey over the head with his baton and handing him to two other officers to be arrested. While Sergeant Brooks and PC Redwood were being stabbed, another group of police officers became separated from their comrades and were surrounded by a screaming mob. One of them, Robert Cully, cried out that he had been hurt. He managed to break free and stagger into a nearby public house, the Calthorpe Arms. PC number 95 Cully collapsed once inside the pub and died with his head being cradled in the lap of a barmaid. The contrast between the reaction to Keith Blakelock's death in a riot in 1985 and the public attitude to that of Robert Cully in similar circumstances a century and a half earlier is truly astonishing and sheds light on the way that the police were widely viewed in Britain at that time. It will be remembered that there was widespread outrage and disgust at the stabbing to death of a police officer during the disturbances in Tottenham in 1985. Condemnation of the murder was all but universal among all classes and types of people. How very different was the response to PC Cully's death in 1833. The inquest opened less than 48 hours later, being convened on Wednesday the 15th of May, and it was held in an upstairs room of the very building in which the police officer had died. The members of this jury at the inquest were far from being hot-headed young radicals. They were rather shopkeepers and householders from the surrounding district. After several sharp exchanges with the coroner, they eventually brought in a verdict not of murder or even manslaughter, but of justifiable homicide on the part of the person who killed PC Cully. They explained this strange verdict by citing the conduct of the police, which was, they claimed, ferocious, brutal, and unprovoked by the people. Therefore, the actions of the police were deemed unlawful. At his trial, the man who had stabbed PC Cully was acquitted. When PC Keith Blakelock was hacked to death by a frenzied mob in the 1985 Broadwater Farm riot, the murder was widely treated as shocking and hitherto unknown type of crime in Britain. It was said that this was the first time a British police officer had been killed under such circumstances. In fact, for much of the 19th century, the beating, stabbing and shooting to death of police officers by enraged crowds was a regular and largely unremarkable occurrence in this country. In the decade following the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1838, no fewer than 16 police officers were murdered by rioting mobs. Some of the disturbances preceding these murders were political, most were not. Attacking the police was simply a popular entertainment for a large number of working class men, and an opportunity to kick, punch, and even stab or shoot a constable was relished. These days, the killing of police officers in the execution of their duty is vanishingly rare. By contrast, in the course of a typical decade during the reign of Queen Victoria, 1860 to 1870, 9 policemen were shot dead, beaten, or stabbed to death in London. Such attacks were not limited to the inner cities, the murder of police officers being just as common in rural areas as it was in towns. Between 1875 and 1895, for example, 17 police officers were shot dead in Britain. 2 were killed in London and 1 in Manchester. The rest died in more rural parts of the country, such as Wiltshire, Cumberland, Berkshire, Staffordshire, and Essex. This is roughly twice as many police officers as have been shot dead in Britain in the last 20 years. It's always good to stop and think a little about the actual history of our country and look at the reality of life 100 or 200 years ago, and then compare it calmly and dispassionately with our own times.